They called him the Butcher of Bitterroot. A man so dangerous, the town of Copper Creek kept him in a reinforced iron cage in the center of the muddy town square, waiting for the hangman. He was a giant, a savage mountain man who hadn't spoken a word in 6 months. So why did Clara Vance, a beautiful, refined woman from Boston, walk right up to the bars of his cage in the pouring rain, kneel in the mud and whisper, "Please, marry me"? The town gasped. The sheriff laughed. But what happened next didn't just shock the territory. It exposed a conspiracy so dark it would rewrite history. You think you know love stories? You haven't heard this one. October 14th, 1883, Copper Creek, Montana Territory. The rain in Copper Creek didn't wash things clean. It just turned the world into a slurry of freezing grey sludge. Clara Vance stood on the porch of the telegraph office, her boots already ruined, clutching a piece of paper that had effectively signed her death warrant. "You have until sundown, Miss Vance," the voice came from behind her. It was slick, oily, and carried the scent of stale tobacco. Clara didn't turn around. She knew it was Sheriff Josiah Paddock. She could feel his eyes on her back, assessing her like livestock. "The law is clear, Sheriff," Clara said, her voice trembling only slightly. "My father's deed states the claim remains in the family only if there is a male heir or a husband to work the land. I have until midnight." "Sundown," Paddock corrected, stepping closer. "Judge Calloway leaves on the evening stagecoach. If you ain't wed by the time the sun hits the peaks, that gold mine reverts to the town jurisdiction, which means it reverts to me." He chuckled, a low, wet sound. "Of course, I've offered you a solution, Clara. Marry me. You keep the house, I run the mine. Everyone wins." Clara gripped the railing. Marry Josiah Paddock, the man who had likely sabotaged her father's wagon 3 weeks ago, sending him off a cliff? She would sooner freeze to death on the plains. "I'd rather marry a wolf," she hissed. "Well," Paddock spat into the mud, "seeing as we're short on wolves, you best find a man fast. But look around, darling. Who in this town is going to cross me to help you?" He was right. Clara looked out at the bleak main street. The miners and shopkeepers averted their eyes. Everyone feared Paddock. He owned the bank, the saloon, and the law. No decent man would marry her, knowing it meant a war with the sheriff. She was alone, thousands of miles from Boston, with an inheritance worth millions slipping through her fingers. Then she saw it. In the center of the square, where the mud was deepest, sat the cage. It was a crude contraption of thick iron bars, open to the elements, barely covered by a rotting tarp. Inside sat a mass of shadows and fur. "Who is that?" Clara asked, distracted. Paddock followed her gaze and grinned wicked. "That? That's Arthur Thorne, the butcher. Killed 3 prospectors with his bare hands up on Black Mountain. We're just waiting on the circuit judge to sign the order so we can hang him next week." Clara stared at the figure. He was massive. Even seated on the wet floor of the cage, his shoulders were as wide as a doorframe. His hair and beard were a tangled mane of black, hiding his face. He sat perfectly still, ignoring the rain soaking him to the bone. "Does he have family?" Clara asked softly. "None. A drifter. A mountain beast." "Is he married?" Paddock laughed, a barking sound that made a passing dog flinch. "Married? Thorne? Lady, he ain't human enough to be married." A desperate, insane idea sparked in Clara's chest. It burned hot, chasing away the cold fear that had gripped her for weeks. She looked at the sun. It was dropping toward the western peaks. She had 2 hours. "Excuse me, Sheriff," Clara said, hiking up her wet skirts. "I have business to attend to." "You can't run from this, Clara," Paddock yelled after her. She didn't run away. She walked straight into the mud, marching directly toward the cage that held the most feared man in the territory. The town went silent. The piano in the saloon stopped. Men stepped out onto the boardwalks. It was a spectacle. The pristine lady in her blue velvet traveling dress, wading through the muck toward the butcher. Clara stopped 2 feet from the bars. The smell was intense: wet wool, pine, and old blood. The man inside didn't look up. "Mr. Thorne?" she said. Her voice was swallowed by the wind. She cleared her throat and spoke louder. "Mr. Thorne?" Slowly the massive head lifted. Clara stopped breathing. Beneath the matted hair and the grime, his eyes were startling. They weren't the eyes of a mad dog. They were the color of steel, sharp, intelligent, and infinitely tired. "Go away," he rumbled. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together deep underground. It was the first time anyone in town had heard him speak in months. "I cannot," Clara said, clutching the iron bars. Her white gloves instantly stained rust red. "My name is Clara Vance, and I have a business proposition for you." Arthur Thorne shifted. The chains on his wrists and ankles clanked heavily. He looked at her gloves, then up to her face. He seemed confused by her presence. "I'm to hang on Tuesday, little bird. I have no business but with the devil." "They say you killed 3 men, Clara said, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "They say a lot of things." "Did you do it?" Arthur stared at her for a long silence. "Would it matter?" "No," Clara whispered, shocking herself. "I need a husband, Mr. Thorne. Right now. Today. If I don't marry by sundown, I lose everything my father worked for to a man who is evil incarnate. I need a signature on a marriage license. That is all." Arthur actually scoffed. "You want to marry a dead man walking? To save a few dollars?" "To save my life," she corrected. "And in exchange, I can save yours." That got his attention. The giant uncoiled, standing up. He towered over her, 7 feet of muscle and menace. He walked to the bars, looming over her. "You can't stop the hangman, lady. The law says a man cannot be executed if he has a pending civil suit regarding property rights of a spouse," Clara recited breathlessly. She had read every law book in her father's study. "If you are my husband, and I list you as a co-owner of the Vance mine, the territory cannot execute you until the title is cleared. That takes months, maybe a year." Arthur narrowed his eyes. "You'd tie yourself to a murderer to buy time." "I'd tie myself to the devil himself to stop Sheriff Paddock from winning," she declared, her blue eyes flashing with a fire that surprised the mountain man. Arthur looked over Clara's shoulder. He saw Paddock standing on the porch of the hotel, watching with a hand on his gun. Arthur knew Paddock. He knew the corruption that rotted this town from the inside out. He had been framed by Paddock's men because he wouldn't sell his land, but no one believed the word of a recluse over the sheriff. Arthur looked back at the small, trembling woman who smelled like lavender and rain. She was terrified of him, yet she stood her ground. "He'll kill you, you know," Arthur said quietly. "Once he realizes what you've done, he won't let you keep that mine." "Then I need a protector, too," Clara whispered, tears finally spilling over. "Please, they are going to kill you anyway. Give me a chance to fight." Arthur reached a hand through the bars. The crowd gasped. Clara flinched but didn't pull away. With a surprisingly gentle finger, he wiped a smudge of mud from her cheek. "Open the cage," Arthur roared, his voice booming across the square. "The lady wants a wedding." The wedding of Clara Vance and Arthur Thorne was the shortest and most tense ceremony in the history of Montana. Judge Calloway, a man who preferred whiskey to law, but feared God just enough to follow procedure, performed the rites right there in the mud, through the bars of the cage. Sheriff Paddock stood 10 feet away, his face a mask of purple rage. His hand hovered over his Colt Navy revolver. He couldn't shoot. Not with the whole town watching, and not with the judge present. "Do you, Clara Vance, take this man?" The judge's voice shook. "I do," Clara said clearly. "And do you, Arthur Thorne?" Arthur looked at Paddock. He smiled, revealing white teeth amidst the black beard. It was a feral, dangerous smile. "I do. Then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife." "The license!" Clara shouted immediately. "Sign it, Judge." The moment the ink was wet, Clara turned to the sheriff. "My husband owns half the Vance mine. According to Territory Statute 14, Section B, no capital punishment can be carried out on a property owner while the estate is in probate or contest. You cannot hang him, Sheriff. Not until the federal surveyor comes from Helena to split the deed. And he isn't due until spring." Paddock stepped forward, kicking mud onto Clara's dress. "You think you're smart, little girl? You just hitched your wagon to a rabid dog. You think the law protects him?" "Judge?" Clara looked at Calloway. The judge sighed, wiping rain from his spectacles. "She's right, Josiah. You hang him now. The feds will strip your badge and maybe your neck. Thorne stays alive until the survey." "Fine," Paddock spat. "He stays alive, but he stays in the cage." "No," Arthur spoke up. "A man cannot manage his property from a cage. I have the right to house arrest at the primary residence." The judge nodded reluctantly. "He's right, Sheriff. He goes to the Vance homestead. But he stays chained." The silence that followed was deafening. Paddock looked like he was going to have a stroke. But he pulled the keys from his belt and threw them into the mud at Clara's feet. "Take him," Paddock whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "Take the beast home, Mrs. Thorne. But remember this. Accidents happen way out there at the mine. Wolves, rock slides, stray bullets." Clara knelt and picked up the keys. Her hand shook so badly she could barely fit the key into the heavy padlock. Click. The door swung open with a groan. Arthur Thorne stepped out. The crowd scrambled back. Without the bars, his size was overwhelming. He stood 6'5", his clothes tattered rags exposing scars on his chest and arms. He took a deep breath of the free air, then looked down at his wife. "Let's go," he grunted. "We need a wagon," Clara said. "No wagon," Arthur said, glancing at the sheriff's deputies who were fingering their rifles. "We walk, harder to ambush a moving target on foot." He grabbed the chains connecting his handcuffs and snapped them taut. "Unlock the legs, leave the hands. It'll make them feel safer." Clara did as she was told. As they walked out of town, Clara leading the giant mountain man like a tame bear, she felt the eyes of every soul in Copper Creek on her. She had saved her mine. She had saved this stranger. But as the lights of the town faded behind them, and the dark, timbered road to the mountains stretched ahead, the reality set in. She was alone in the wilderness, with a man accused of tearing 3 people apart. They walked for 2 hours in silence. The rain turned to sleet. Clara was freezing, her velvet dress heavy and sodden. She stumbled over a root, falling hard onto the muddy track. She waited for him to yell, or to ignore her. Instead, she felt 2 massive hands scoop her up. Arthur lifted her effortlessly, setting her back on her feet. He didn't let go immediately. His hands were warm. "Why did you really do it?" Arthur asked, his voice low. "The mine isn't worth dying for." "My father," Clara chattered, her teeth clicking together. He found something in that mine. Not just gold. He wrote to me before he died. He said he found the devil's vein. He said Paddock killed a man to keep it secret. I couldn't let Paddock win. I couldn't let my father's death be for nothing." Arthur went still. The Devil's Vein. You know it? Arthur looked into the dark woods, scanning for threats. I know it. And if that's what your father found, Paddock won't wait for spring. He'll come for us tonight. Arthur looked at the chains on his wrists. You have the key? Yes. Unlock me. But, the judge said. To hell with the judge, Arthur growled, turning to face her. Lightning flashed, illuminating his scarred face. If Paddock is coming, you don't need a husband, Clara. You need the monster they think I am. Unlock these chains, or we both die right here. Clara hesitated. The stories of the butcher of Bitterroot swam in her head. If she freed his hands, he could snap her neck and vanish. She heard the snap of a twig in the woods behind them. Then the click of a rifle hammer. Arthur heard it too. He didn't wait. He spun around, placing his body between Clara and the noise, holding his chained hands up like a shield. Crack! A gunshot rang out. A spark flew from the iron chain on Arthur's wrist as the bullet deflected. Key! Arthur roared. Now! The second gunshot tore through the fabric of Clara's sleeve, grazing the skin of her upper arm. She screamed, dropping into the mud. The key, Clara! Arthur roared, his body acting as a human barricade between her and the darkness of the tree line. Her fingers were slick with rain and terror. She fumbled for the small iron key in her pocket, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The darkness of the woods was alive with the sounds of men moving. Heavy boots on wet leaves, the click of reloading rifles. I have it! She cried, shoving the key into the padlock binding Arthur's wrists. She twisted it. The mechanism was stiff with rust and grit. Come on, she begged. A voice called out from the trees, a voice Clara recognized. It was Deputy Clyde Miller. Don't make this hard, Miss Vance. Step away from the animal and we'll make it quick for him. You can walk back to town. Twist it, Arthur commanded, ignoring the voice. With a final desperate wrench, the lock clicked. The heavy chains fell into the slush with a wet thud. Arthur Thorne didn't just step forward. He exploded into motion. He didn't run away. He ran toward the guns. Clara scrambled backward, pressing herself against the trunk of a pine tree, watching in horror and awe. Arthur moved with a speed that defied his size. He was a shadow among shadows. A muzzle flash lit up the woods to the left. Bang! Arthur ducked under the shot, lunging at the shooter. There was a sickening crunch, a strangled cry, and then silence. He's loose! Someone screamed. He's got the chains off! Shoot him! 3 men broke from the cover of the trees, rushing the road. They were Paddock's hired guns, ruffians from the railroad camps. They had knives and clubs, expecting a chained prisoner. They found a mountain storm in human form. Arthur caught the first man's swinging arm, twisting it until the bone snapped with the sound of a dry branch breaking. He used the man's momentum to hurl him into the second attacker. The third man, a bearded giant named Jeb, swung a heavy mining pick. Arthur didn't flinch. He caught the handle of the pick inches from his face. He roared, a sound of primal rage that had been building for 6 months inside a cage, and headbutted Jeb. The man crumpled like a wet sack of flour. It was over in less than a minute. 4 men lay groaning in the mud. Arthur stood panting, rain dripping from his matted beard, his fists clenched. He looked wild, terrifying. He turned to Clara. His chest was heaving. "Are you hit?" Clara touched her arm. Her fingers came away red. Just a graze. Arthur walked over to her. The adrenaline was fading from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, tactical focus. He ripped a strip of cloth from his own tattered shirt and tied it tight around her arm. His hands were rough, but his touch was surprisingly careful. "We can't go to your ranch," Arthur said, his voice low. "That was just the greeting party. Paddock will have men waiting at the house, and more on the road by dawn." "Then where?" Clara asked, looking at the unconscious men. "We have nowhere to go. The law is against us." "The law is a piece of paper," Arthur grunted. "Survival is what matters now. We go up, above the timberline." "The mountains." Clara shivered. "In this storm, we'll freeze." Arthur looked down at her, his grey eyes intense. "I lived on Black Mountain for 5 years, Clara. I know caves that aren't on any map. I know trails that deer don't even use. If you want to live to fight Paddock for your mine, you follow me. If you want to die warm, walk back to town." Clara looked back toward Copper Creek. She thought of Paddock's oily smile. She thought of her father's letter. "Lead the way, husband," she said. They left the road, plunging into the deep forest. The climb was brutal. The rain turned to sleet and then to heavy, wet snow as they gained altitude. Clara's velvet dress, once a symbol of her status, became a heavy, freezing cage. She stumbled constantly, her city boots sliding on the slick rocks. Every time she fell, Arthur was there. He didn't coddle her, but he didn't leave her behind. He would simply reach back, grab her hand, and haul her up the next ledge. They climbed for hours. The wind howled like a banshee. Clara's vision began to blur. She was so cold she couldn't feel her feet. I can't," she whispered, sinking into a snowbank. "Arthur, leave me." Arthur stopped. He looked at the shivering woman. He didn't speak. Instead, he turned around and knelt in the snow. "Get on." "What?" "Get on my back. Now." Clara didn't have the strength to argue. She wrapped her arms around his neck. He stood up with a grunt, carrying her as easily as if she were a backpack. He trudged on, a solitary figure fighting the blizzard, carrying the woman who had saved his life. As Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, leaning her head against his shoulder, she smelled the pine and wood smoke in his hair. She felt the heat radiating from his massive back. For the first time since her father died, she felt safe. "Almost there," he muttered into the wind. "Hang on, little bird." Clara woke to the smell of roasting meat and the crackle of a fire. She bolted upright, gasping. She was lying on a bed of furs, bear and elk skins piled thick on a rough wooden frame. Above her, rock walls sloped upward to a natural chimney where smoke curled lazily toward a crack of daylight. It was a cave, but it had been turned into a home. The front was walled off with heavy logs and a sturdy door. Shelves were carved into the rock, holding dried herbs, jars of preserves, and simple tools. She looked around. Arthur. He was sitting by the fire, sharpening a long hunting knife, but Clara didn't recognize him at first. The matted, filthy beard was gone. He had shaved it off with the knife, leaving only a heavy shadow of stubble. His hair had been washed and tied back with a leather thong. Without the grime and the wild hair, the butcher of Bitterroot was a shockingly handsome man. He had a strong, square jaw and high cheekbones. A thin white scar ran from his temple to his cheek, a souvenir of some past violence, but it didn't mar his face. It gave him character. He looked to be about 32, much younger than the old beast the town assumed he was. He looked up. His eyes were still that piercing steel grey, but the madness she had seen in the cage was gone. "Eat," he said, nodding to a wooden skewer over the fire. "Rabbit, it's not much, but it's hot." Clara wrapped a fur blanket around herself and moved to the fire. Her blue dress was hanging on a line, drying. She was wearing an oversized flannel shirt that must have been his. You shaved," she said, accepting the meat. Arthur touched his jaw self-consciously. "Hard to think with that much dirt on you. Felt like I was still in the cage." "Who are you, Arthur?" Clara asked softly, taking a bite of the rabbit. It was delicious. Truly, the town says you're a drifter, a killer. Arthur stared into the flames. My name is Arthur Morgan Thorne. I was a surveyor for the Union Pacific Railroad 10 years back. I came out here to map the passes. Clara's eyes widened. You're an educated man. I was, until I found something I wasn't supposed to. He poked the fire. I found gold on Black Mountain, but not just gold. I found a survey marker from the 1860s. It proved that the land where Copper Creek sits, the land Paddock claims to own, actually belongs to the indigenous tribes by treaty. Paddock's deed is a forgery. The whole town is illegal. Clara gasped. That's why he hates you. That's why he caged you. I went to the judge with the proof, Arthur said bitterly. Next thing I know, 3 prospectors are dead, their bodies found at my camp. Paddock's men planted them. They branded me the butcher. They didn't hang me immediately, because Paddock wanted the map. He wanted to know where I hid the survey marker. Do you still have it? Arthur tapped the side of his head. It's up here, and the marker is still buried where I left it. Clara set her food down. The pieces were coming together. My father. He wrote about a devil's vein. He said it was the source of all the evil in the valley. The devil's vein isn't a gold vein, Clara, Arthur said darkly. It's a fault line in the mountain, a deep cavern system. That's where Paddock dumps the bodies. The prospectors he kills, the workers who complain, the women who say no. That's why he wants your mine. The entrance to the devil's vein is on your land. If anyone explores the Vance mine deep enough, they'll break through into his graveyard. Clara felt sick. He killed my father because he found it. Likely, Arthur nodded. And he'll kill us if we go back. But we have to, Clara said, her voice trembling but firm. We can't live in a cave forever, Arthur. Winter is coming. And if we run, Paddock wins. He keeps killing. Arthur looked at her. In the firelight, her pale skin glowed. She was small, fragile, and utterly terrified, yet she had more courage than any man he had ever known. She had walked into mud to save a monster. I have nothing left to lose, Arthur said. But you could take a horse, ride to Helena. Be safe. I am your wife, Clara said. She reached out and took his rough hand. It may have been a business deal, Arthur, but I took a vow. For better or for worse, I am not leaving you. Arthur looked at their joined hands. A strange emotion flickered in his eyes. Hope, perhaps, or fear of losing something he had just found. He squeezed her hand gently. Then we don't just go back. We go to war. He stood up and walked to a heavy wooden chest in the corner of the cave. He threw it open. Inside were weapons, clean, oiled, and ready. A Winchester repeating rifle, 2 Colt revolvers, boxes of ammunition, and bundles of dynamite. I was saving this for a rainy day, Arthur said, a grim smile touching his lips. I reckon it's pouring outside. 2 nights later, the storm broke. The moon hung full and bright over the valley, turning the snow into a landscape of silver and blue shadows. Clara and Arthur lay on their stomachs on a ridge overlooking the Vance mine. The homestead was dark, burned out. Paddock's men had torched the house just as Arthur predicted, but the mine entrance was lit by lanterns. 4 guards patrolled the perimeter. They're guarding an empty hole, Clara whispered. Why? They aren't guarding it to keep people out, Arthur replied, adjusting the sight on his rifle. They're guarding it to keep the workers in. Look. He handed her the brass telescope he had brought from the cave. Clara squinted through the lens. She saw a line of men in chains being marched out of the mine entrance, carrying heavy sacks. They looked starved, beaten. Forced labor, Clara breathed. Prisoners. Drifters. Men who couldn't pay their debts at Paddock's saloon. He enslaves them to dig his gold. Arthur lowered the telescope. If we expose this, the federal marshals will hang Paddock and every deputy in town. How do we get in? Clara asked. There are too many of them. We don't use the front door, Arthur said. He pointed to a jagged peak of rock about half a mile up the slope, directly above the mine. The ventilation shaft. Your father dug it 5 years ago to clear the gas. It's narrow, steep, and full of bats, but it drops right into the lower level, into the devil's vein, right into the belly of the beast. The climb to the shaft was treacherous. The snow was knee-deep. When they reached the grate covering the shaft, Arthur pried it open with a crowbar. A blast of warm, stale air, smelling of sulphur and rot, hit them. I go first, Arthur said, tying a rope around his waist. If I tug twice, you follow. He lowered himself into the blackness. Clara waited, shivering in the moonlight, holding the other end of the rope. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, 2 sharp tugs. Clara slid into the darkness. She rappelled down 40 feet, landing on a pile of loose shale. It was pitch black. A match flared, and Arthur's face appeared, illuminated by the small flame. He lit a lantern, keeping the wick low. They were in a natural cavern, not a man-made tunnel. The walls glittered with moisture. Quiet now, Arthur whispered. They crept forward. The cavern opened up into a massive chamber. What Clara saw made her clamp a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. To the left, a vein of silver as thick as a tree trunk ran through the rock, millions of dollars in raw ore. Paddock had been mining it for years, but to the right, it was a pit, and in the pit lay the evidence of Paddock's reign. Skeletons, dozens of them. Some old, bleached white, some fresh, still clad in rags. The accidents, the disappeared. Dear God, Clara wept silently. There, Arthur pointed. Near the edge of the pit lay a leather satchel, preserved by the dry cave air. Arthur slid down the bank and grabbed it. He scrambled back up, brushing off the dust. He opened it. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a brass survey marker. This is it, Arthur said, his voice shaking with vindication. The surveyor's journal, the one who disappeared 10 years ago. It has the original maps. It proves everything. Clara grabbed his arm. We have it, let's go. Suddenly, a boom echoed through the cavern. The ground shook violently, knocking them both to their knees. Rocks rained down from the ceiling. Dynamite! Arthur yelled, shielding Clara with his body. They found the shaft? Clara cried. No. Arthur looked toward the tunnel leading to the main mine. That came from the entrance. Paddock is sealing the mine. Why? Because he knows we're here. A voice boomed from the darkness. Lanterns flared to life at the far end of the cavern. Sheriff Josiah Paddock stood there, flanked by 10 men with rifles. He was smoking a cigar, looking pleased. I found your little campsite in the woods, Arthur, Paddock called out, his voice echoing off the walls of the mass grave. I knew you'd come for the proof. You always were a sentimental fool. Let her go, Paddock. Arthur stepped in front of Clara, drawing his revolvers. No can do, Paddock sighed. She's seen the graveyard. Shame, really. She would have made a pretty wife. Paddock signaled to his men. Blow the support beams. Bring the mountain down on them. I want them buried with the rest of the trash. Run! Arthur shoved Clara toward a narrow fissure in the rock wall behind them, a crack barely wide enough for a human. Not without you! Clara screamed. Go, I'll hold them off. Arthur turned and opened fire. His Colts barked, taking down 2 of Paddock's men instantly. The cavern erupted in gunfire. Bullets sparked off the rocks around Arthur. He was one man against an army, standing on the edge of a grave, fighting to buy his wife seconds of time. Clara squeezed into the fissure. She looked back one last time. She saw Arthur take a bullet to the shoulder, stumble and keep firing. He grabbed a stick of dynamite from his belt, lit the fuse with his cigar, and hurled it toward Paddock's men. Boom! The explosion collapsed the tunnel between Arthur and the gunman, sealing him in the cavern with them. Then a secondary rumble began. A deep, groaning sound from the earth itself. The main supports were giving way. The Devil's Vein was collapsing. "Arthur!" Clara screamed into the dust and darkness, but there was no answer. Only the roar of falling rock. November 1st, 1883. Helena, Montana Territory. Clara Vance looked nothing like the Boston socialite who had arrived in the territory a month prior. As she stood in the opulent office of Governor John Schuyler Crosby, her skin was wind-burned, her hands were wrapped in dirty bandages, and her dress was a patchwork of rags. She placed the leather-bound journal on the governor's mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy thud, smelling of sulfur and death. "This," Clara rasped, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation, "is the confession of Sheriff Josiah Paddock. It contains the names of 47 men buried in the lower cavern of the Vance mine. It also contains the original survey maps proving the town of Copper Creek is built on stolen land." Governor Crosby, a stern man with a heavy mustache, looked from the book to the woman. Beside him stood U.S. Marshal Jedediah Stone, a man known for hanging outlaws from the Missouri to the Rockies. "Mrs. Thorne," the governor said carefully, "you are accusing a duly appointed sheriff of mass murder and grand larceny. And you claim your husband, the man known as the Butcher, died trying to stop him?" "My husband," Clara said, her eyes hard as flint, "was Arthur Morgan Thorne, a surveyor for the Union Pacific. He was a hero, and yes, he is dead. Paddock buried him under 1,000 tons of rock." She didn't cry. She had no tears left. She had crawled through a fissure in the rock for 2 miles in total darkness, bleeding and alone, guided only by the draft of air. She had walked for 3 days to reach the telegraph line at Silver Bow. "If this journal is authentic," Marshal Stone rumbled, picking up the book, "then Paddock hangs. But we need to go to Copper Creek. We need to see the bodies." "The mine is collapsed," Clara said. "Paddock will claim it was a mining accident caused by a madman. He will say I am hysterical. He has the town terrified." "Then we will bring enough law to make them brave," Stone said, checking his Colt peacemaker. November 5th, 1883. Copper Creek. The arrival of the U.S. Marshals changed the atmosphere of Copper Creek instantly. The muddy streets were cleared. The saloon fell silent. Sheriff Paddock stood on the porch of his office, his deputies fanned out behind him. He looked confident, smug even. "Marshal Stone," Paddock called out, tipping his hat. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I see you brought the widow. Sad business, that. Her husband went mad, blew up my mine, killed himself and a dozen of my best workers." "That's a lie," Clara screamed from the carriage. "He saved them. You killed them." "Restrain yourself, ma'am," Paddock sneered. "Grief makes people say crazy things." "We're holding an inquest, Josiah," Marshal Stone said, dismounting his horse. "Right now, in the town hall, Judge Calloway is presiding." The trial was a farce from the beginning. Judge Calloway was sweating profusely, glancing nervously at Paddock's men who lined the back of the room. Paddock's lawyer, a slick man from Chicago named Horace Blackwood, tore Clara's testimony apart. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood paced the floor, "we have the word of a woman who married a known killer in a cage, a woman who stood to lose her inheritance. Is it not possible she conspired with the Butcher to destroy the mine for insurance money?" And when the explosives went off early, she concocted this story of a mass grave to cover her tracks. The jury, composed of men who owed Paddock money, nodded along. "But the journal!" Clara cried, holding up the book. "It's in the surveyor's handwriting." "A forgery," Blackwood dismissed, "created by your husband during his months in the mountains." It was unraveling. Clara could feel it. The truth didn't matter here. Power mattered. Paddock sat in the front row, cleaning his fingernails with a knife, smiling at her. He had won. He had killed Arthur, stolen the mine, and now he was going to lock her away in an asylum. "I call for a verdict," Paddock shouted. "This has gone on long enough." "Wait," Marshal Stone stood up. "We haven't been able to excavate the mine yet. We need physical proof of the bodies." "The rock is too unstable," Paddock lied. "It would take months. We can't keep this town on hold for months." Judge Calloway banged his gavel. "The marshal makes a valid point, but without bodies, the evidence is circumstantial. I am inclined to dismiss the charges against Sheriff Paddock." Clara slumped in her chair. It was over. Arthur had died for nothing. Boom! A sound came from outside, not an explosion, a heavy, rhythmic thudding, like a battering ram. Boom! The double doors of the town hall shuddered. "What in blazes?" Paddock stood up, hand on his gun. Crack! The doors flew open, splintering off their hinges. A freezing wind swept into the courtroom, extinguishing half the lanterns. Standing in the doorway, backlit by the grey afternoon light, was a figure that made the blood freeze in Paddock's veins. He was covered in grey dust from head to toe. His clothes were shredded ribbons. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, bound with a piece of wire. But in his right hand, he dragged a heavy canvas sack. It was Arthur. He looked like a revenant, a spirit risen from the earth itself. He limped forward, every step a struggle, leaving a trail of grey dust on the floorboards. "Ghost!" someone screamed. Arthur didn't look at the crowd. He looked straight at Josiah Paddock. "You," Paddock whispered, his face draining of colour. "I saw the mountain fall on you." Arthur stopped in the centre of the room. He swayed, his strength nearly gone. He looked at Clara. His lips cracked into a weary smile. "I told you, I'd hold them off." He turned to the judge and threw the canvas sack onto the table. It split open. Gold spilled out. But not just gold. Skulls, 3 of them. And personal effects, belt buckles, pocket watches. "I dug," Arthur rasped, his voice sounding like grinding gravel. "For 3 days. I dug through the devil's vein. I found the air shaft. And I brought friends." Arthur stepped aside. Behind him, in the doorway, a procession emerged. Men in rags, emaciated, covered in soot, blinking in the light. The slave miners, the men Paddock claimed had died in the accident. "We're not dead, Sheriff," one of the miners croaked. "Arthur dug us out." The courtroom erupted. Marshal Stone drew his weapon instantly, levelling it at Paddock. "Josiah Paddock, you are under arrest for murder and slavery." Paddock looked at the miners, then at Arthur, then at the marshal. His eyes went wild. He roared, drawing his gun. "I am the law." He aimed not at the marshal, but at Clara. Arthur moved. Despite his broken arm, despite the exhaustion, he threw himself in front of his wife. Bang! Arthur jerked back. Bang! Bang! Marshal Stone fired twice. Paddock dropped to his knees, a look of shock on his face, before falling face first onto the floorboards, dead. Clara screamed, catching Arthur as he fell. "No, no, not now, Arthur!" She pulled him into her lap, her hands pressing against the new wound in his chest. The room swirled around them. The marshals were securing the deputies. The miners were cheering, but Clara saw only the grey eyes of her husband. "You're okay," she sobbed. "You're okay." Arthur looked up at the ceiling. He took a shallow breath. Did we win?" "Yes," Clara wept. "We won. Paddock is dead. The truth is out." "Good," Arthur whispered. His eyes drifted to hers. "Business deal. Concluded." His head rolled to the side. His eyes closed. November 5th, 1883. The long night. The courtroom floor was stained with the blood of two men, the tyrant who had ruled Copper Creek with fear and the savior who had crawled out of the earth to stop him. "Get him up, now!" Marshal Stone barked, holstering his smoking weapon. "Doc, where is the doctor?" Dr. Aris Thorne, no relation, a shaky old man who had spent years patching up Paddock's victims in silence, rushed forward. He ripped open Arthur's shirt. The bullet had entered just below the collarbone. The chest wound was frothing, a sucking chest wound. "The lung is hit," the doctor announced, his hands trembling. "We have to move him. The table in the saloon is the only thing sturdy enough." 6 of the freed miners, men who looked like walking skeletons, stepped forward. They didn't speak. They simply lifted the massive frame of the man who had dug them out. They carried Arthur Thorne like a fallen king through the splintered doors of the town hall, across the muddy street, and into the Golden Nugget Saloon. They swept the whiskey bottles off the bar. They laid him down. For the next 12 hours, the town of Copper Creek held its breath. Clara didn't leave his side. She held the lantern while the doctor dug for the lead. She didn't flinch when the scalpel cut into the muscle. She didn't look away when the blood flowed. "I can't get the bleeding to stop," the doctor whispered at 3:15 a.m. "He's lost too much. You should say your goodbyes, Mrs. Thorne." Clara looked at the doctor with eyes that burned with a terrifying intensity. He survived a cage for 6 months. He survived a mountain falling on him. He did not survive all of that, just to die on a bar top. "Fix him." She leaned down to Arthur's ear. His skin was grey, clammy with the sweat of shock. "You listen to me, Arthur Morgan Thorne. The contract isn't void yet. We have unfinished business. You don't get to leave." The fever dreams. Arthur didn't die. But he didn't wake up either. For 3 weeks, he lay in the back room of the boarding house, consumed by a raging infection. The town outside began to change, but Arthur remained trapped in his own mind. In his delirium, he wasn't in a warm bed. He was back in the cage. He was back in the dark tunnels of the Devil's Vein. He thrashed and screamed, fighting invisible demons. "The rocks!" he would shout. "Hold the ceiling! Get them out!" Every time the nightmares came, a cool hand would touch his forehead. A voice, soft, refined, but strong as steel, would anchor him. "You are safe. You are home." It was the miners who saved him in the end, not with medicine, but with gratitude. They took turns sitting on the porch of the boarding house, whittling, guarding the window. They brought fresh water from the high springs, swearing it had healing properties. They brought bear fat for his chest. On the morning of the first snow of December, the fever broke. Arthur opened his eyes. The pain was immediate, a sharp fire in his chest and a dull ache in his hip. But the fog was gone. He looked around the room. It smelled of lavender and wood smoke. Clara was asleep in a chair next to the bed, her head resting on the mattress. She looked exhausted, thinner than he remembered, but beautiful. Arthur reached out a trembling hand and touched her hair. She woke instantly. Her blue eyes widened. "Arthur? You're still here," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I told you." Clara smiled, tears spilling over instantly. "I take my vows seriously." The rebirth recovery was slow. The winter of 1883 was brutal, sealing the town off from the rest of the world. But it was a blessing in disguise. It gave them time. As Arthur learned to walk again, first with crutches, then with a cane, he watched the town transform. With Paddock dead and his deputies in federal chains, the fear evaporated. The miners formed a council. They voted to rename the town. They called it White Pine, after the trees that had sheltered Arthur and Clara during their escape. But the biggest change was in Arthur himself. He couldn't swing a pickaxe anymore. His shoulder would never have that strength again. But his mind was sharp. The man who had been a surveyor, an engineer, finally had a canvas. He drew up plans for a safer mine shaft. He designed a water filtration system for the town. The butcher became the architect. One evening in March, as the thaw began, Clara found Arthur standing on the porch, looking up at the peaks. "The survey team from Washington came today," Clara said, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "They confirmed your maps. The land is being returned to the Territory Trust, but the mine, the Devil's Vein, is ours." "Seal it," Arthur said instantly. Clara paused. "There is millions of dollars in silver down there, Arthur." "And 47 ghosts," Arthur replied, turning to face her. "Paddock's greed built a graveyard. I won't profit from it. Blow the entrance. Seal it forever." "I already gave the order," Clara smiled. "I just wanted to make sure we were partners on the decision." Arthur laughed, a low, rusty sound. "Always partners." He looked at her, really looked at her. For months, they had been surviving. Then they had been recovering. They had never truly courted. They were married by a judge in the mud to save a life, not to build one. Arthur stepped closer. He took her hand, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping. "That day in the square, you asked me to marry you. You saved my life. You gave me a name again. And you saved mine," Clara whispered. "But it was a deal," Arthur continued. "A transaction. I don't want a transaction anymore. I have nothing to offer you but a bad leg, a scarred face, and a past full of shadows. But if you're willing..." He reached into his pocket. He didn't have a ring. He had taken a piece of the pure silver ore from the one nugget he had kept, and he had spent weeks hammering it, polishing it, shaping it into a simple, shining band. "Clara Vance," he said, sinking down onto his good knee, wincing slightly but refusing to stop. "I am asking you properly this time. No cages, no guns, no sheriffs. Just a man who loves you more than he loves his next breath. Will you be my wife? For real?" Clara fell to her knees in the slush beside him, ignoring the mud that ruined her dress, just as she had that first day. "Yes," she sobbed, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, Arthur. 1,000 times." Epilogue. The key 5 years later. The scars on the land had healed. Grass grew over the collapsed entrance of the Devil's Vein. White Pine was a thriving community, known not for lawlessness, but for the quality of its timber and the fairness of its wages. On the porch of a large cedar home overlooking the valley, Arthur Thorne sat in a rocking chair. His hair was graying at the temples, and he still walked with a limp, but his eyes were bright. A boy, 4 years old with wild black hair, ran across the porch. "Papa! Papa! Look what I found!" The boy held up an old, rusted piece of iron. It was heavy, shaped like a large T. Arthur took it. He recognized it instantly. It was a piece of the cage bars. The town had torn the cage down years ago, but scraps of it still turned up in the mud sometimes. "What is it, Papa?" the boy asked. Arthur looked at the rusted metal. He felt the phantom weight of it around him. He remembered the cold, the rain, the hopelessness, and then he remembered the woman in the blue velvet dress walking through the storm. Clara stepped onto the porch, carrying a tray of lemonade. She saw the iron bar in Arthur's hand. She went still. Arthur looked up at his wife. He tossed the iron bar into the tall grass, far away from the house. "It's nothing, son," Arthur said, pulling the boy into his lap. "Just an old piece of junk. We don't need it." He looked at Clara. "We don't keep cages here. We only keep the keys." He tapped his chest pocket, where a small, silver key still rested against his heart. The key she had turned. Clara smiled, the sun catching the silver band on her finger. She sat on the arm of his chair, resting her head on his shoulder as the sun set over the mountains, no longer a place of darkness, but a golden kingdom that belonged to them. That is the true-ish story of Clara and Arthur Thorne. While the names have been changed to protect the descendants of the families involved, the legend of the mail-order bride and the caged man remains one of the most enduring tales of the American West. It reminds us that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones in cages, they are the ones holding the keys. And sometimes love isn't found in a ballroom, but in the mud, under the shadow of a hangman's noose. Wow, what a journey. From a death row cage to a fight for survival in the devil's vein. I hope you enjoyed this dramatic retelling of a wild Western romance. If you loved Arthur and Clara's story, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Would you have unlocked the cage? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.